The morning I first saw that collapsing barn, Duke, my 8-year-old German shepherd, planted his feet in the gravel and refused to move another step forward. His ears were pinned back, not in fear, but in that focused way he got when something wasn't quite right. I should have listened to him then. Instead, I tugged his leash and muttered something about getting on with it, the way a man does when he's trying to convince himself he's making a smart decision rather than a foolish one. The auction was winding down, and most folks had already gone home with their prizes: antique tractors, farm equipment that still had some life left in it, boxes of tools that might fetch a few dollars at weekend garage sales. What remained was this sorry excuse for a barn, listing to one side like a drunk trying to find his balance. The auctioneer was practically begging for bids, starting at $200 and working his way down. When he hit $500, I raised my hand. My neighbor Chuck, standing beside me with his arms crossed, just shook his head and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hell, Frank, you might as well set that money on fire." But there was something about that barn that called to me, something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon sun hit those weathered boards, casting shadows that seemed to hide more than they revealed, or maybe it was just the stubborn streak I'd inherited from my father, the same streak that had got me through 35 years of marriage, raising 3 kids, and building a small business from nothing. Duke had calmed down by then, but I noticed how he kept looking toward the structure, his nose twitching in that methodical way that meant he'd caught a scent worth investigating. There was intelligence in his dark eyes, the kind of focused attention I'd learned to respect over the years we'd worked together on various restoration projects. The smell of old hay and weathered wood drifted across the auction yard, mixed with the diesel exhaust from departing trucks and the lingering sweetness of autumn wildflowers growing along the fence line. I remember thinking that this was what September should smell like, the convergence of growing things and dying things, of work completed and work yet to be done. The barn stood against a backdrop of rolling hills that had been farmed for over a century, their contours softened by generations of plowing and planting, dotted with the occasional oak tree that had been spared for shade or sentiment. My childhood had been shaped by stories of making something from nothing, stories told by my grandfather while we worked together in his cluttered garage behind the house where I'd grown up. He'd been a mechanic during the war, coming home with hands that could coax life from the most broken-down engines and a respect for anything built to last. The garage had smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, of the coffee he kept warm on a hot plate, and the cherry tobacco he smoked in an old pipe that had belonged to his father. He'd taught me that sometimes the most valuable things were the ones other people overlooked, the ones that required patience and imagination to see their true worth. I remember the first time he'd shown me how to read the story a piece of machinery told through its wear patterns, its modifications, the care or neglect it had received. We'd been working on a 1948 Ford pickup that someone had abandoned behind the local grain elevator, its bed rusted through and its engine seized from years of neglect. "Look here," he'd said, running his calloused fingers along the frame rails. "See how these welds are cleaner than the factory ones." Someone loved this truck enough to reinforce it properly. And here, he'd pointed to wear marks on the gear shift lever. "See how the metal's worn smooth? That's not from abuse, that's from years of careful use by someone who understood how to treat machinery right." My grandmother would tell stories of how he'd found his first shop tools in a pile of military surplus that nobody else wanted, how he'd turned those discarded pieces into the foundation of a business that fed his family for 40 years. She described the patience he'd shown in cleaning each tool, researching its purpose, learning to use it properly. "Your grandfather never saw junk," she'd tell me while we shelled peas on the front porch, the sound of his work drifting from the garage. He saw possibility. He saw stories that hadn't been finished yet. Growing up, I'd spent every summer helping him in that shop, learning that the smell of motor oil and the sound of metal on metal weren't just part of work, they were part of a legacy. He taught me to listen to engines, to feel for the subtle vibrations that indicated worn bearings or misaligned timing, to recognize the difference between a problem that could be fixed and one that required starting over. Most importantly, he taught me that as the most extraordinary discoveries were hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for someone with enough curiosity and stubbornness to look past the surface. The lessons went beyond mechanics, though. He'd shown me how to research the history of vehicles that came through the shop, how to trace ownership through registration documents and service records, how to piece together the stories of the people who had owned and cared for them. "Every machine has a biography," he'd say, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. "Your job is to learn enough of that biography to know what the machine needs to be whole again." When I met Sarah in 1985 at a church social, she understood this about me from the start. She knew that my need to investigate, to restore, to uncover hidden value wasn't just a hobby. It was how I made sense of the world. I remember our third date, when I'd taken her to see a 1967 Mustang I was restoring in my own small garage. The car was in pieces, engine components spread across workbenches, body panels leaning against the walls, interior seats stacked in the corner. Most women would have seen chaos and wondered what they'd gotten themselves into. Sarah had walked slowly around the workspace, asking questions about each component, listening carefully as I explained the process of restoration. She'd picked up the original steering wheel, running her fingers over the cracked vinyl, and said, "Someone loved this car once. You can feel it in how carefully everything was maintained before whatever happened to make them give it up." That's when I knew she was the woman I wanted to marry, not because she shared my interest in old cars, but because she understood the deeper principle that guided my work. Through 38 years of marriage, she'd watched me bring home everything from that '67 Mustang to a roll-top desk that most people would have chopped up for firewood, from a 1920s Victrola that needed a complete mechanical rebuild to a set of Depression-era dining room furniture that required months of patient refinishing. Each time, she'd just smile and ask where I was planning to put it, never doubting that I'd find a way to make it beautiful again. She'd learned to recognize the signs of a worthwhile project, the quality of construction that remained visible despite surface damage, the completeness of original components, the evidence of care that previous owners had invested. More importantly, she'd become my research partner, helping me trace the histories of our finds through library archives and courthouse records, teaching me how to navigate the emerging world of internet genealogy and historical databases. She had a gift for finding the human stories behind the objects, for locating descendants of original owners who could provide context and meaning that transformed mere restoration into something approaching resurrection. Our children had grown up understanding this rhythm. They'd learned to help me strip paint on Sunday afternoons, the garage doors open to let in fresh air and the sounds of the neighborhood. They'd learned to hold flashlights while I worked under the hood of some forgotten classic, to appreciate the satisfaction of seeing something broken become whole again. Each of them had favorite projects. Our daughter Jennifer still talked about the antique doll buggy we'd restored when she was 8, complete with new fabric upholstery that Sarah had sewn by hand. Our son Michael had helped me rebuild the engine on a 1955 Chevy pickup that we'd later given to him as a high school graduation present. Our youngest Tommy had shown the most aptitude for the work, spending hours beside me learning to sand and prime and paint with the patience that quality restoration demanded. When the grandchildren started coming, 5 of them now, ranging from 4 to 16, they'd inherited this same curiosity about the stories objects could tell. Duke had been part of the family through it all, first as a puppy who'd chew on shop rags and knock over paint cans, now as the steady companion who seemed to understand the importance of each project. He'd learned to stay clear of power tools and chemical strippers, but he was always present, lying in whatever patch of sunlight reached the garage floor, his presence a calming constant in the sometimes frustrating work of bringing old things back to life. The barn purchase had caused quite a stir in our small Ohio town. Chuck made sure everyone at the diner knew about my $500 pile of kindling, and the story spread with the kind of gleeful speed that small-town gossip achieves. At first, it stung. I'd built a reputation over the decades as someone who could spot value where others couldn't, who could restore and flip enough pieces to supplement my pension and help with the grandkids' college funds. This felt different, though riskier and more personal somehow. The ridicule wasn't entirely unfounded. The barn was in genuinely terrible condition, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow damage from several harsh winters. The foundation stones were solid hand-cut limestone that spoke to the quality of the original construction, but everything above ground level seemed to be held up more by habit than structural integrity. The siding was weathered gray, with gaps between boards wide enough to see daylight through, and the main doors hung at awkward angles that suggested the hinges were barely functional. Sarah had just raised an eyebrow when I told her about it over dinner that night. "What are you planning to do with a barn, Frank?" she'd asked, cutting into her pork chop with the precision she brought to everything. I told her about the solid foundation stones, about the hand-hewn beams that were probably worth more than I'd paid for the whole structure, about the corrugated metal roofing that could be salvaged and resold. But even as I spoke, I knew those weren't the real reasons. There was something else, something I couldn't articulate yet, a feeling that had started when Duke first refused to approach the building and had grown stronger during the brief inspection I'd managed before the auction. The property came with 12 acres of overgrown farmland, accessed by a gravel lane that wound through stands of mature oak and maple trees. The isolation was part of what had kept serious buyers away. It was too remote for suburban development, but not large enough for commercial farming. For me, though, the privacy was an asset. I could work at my own pace, take my time exploring whatever mysteries the barn might contain, without neighbors watching my every move. Duke had spent that entire first week circling the property with me, his behavior growing more focused each day. While I measured beams and assessed the structural damage, he'd patrol the perimeter with methodical precision, stopping at irregular intervals to sniff deeply at spots that looked unremarkable to me. The barn sat in a natural depression, surrounded by hills that provided protection from the prevailing winds, but also created an environment where sounds and scents could linger longer than they might in more exposed locations. I'd assumed his interest was just the excitement of new territory to explore. There were certainly plenty of interesting scents for a dog to investigate, from the groundhogs that had burrowed under the foundation to the barn owls that nested in the rafters. But there was an intensity to his movements that reminded me of his younger days, when he'd been trained for search and rescue work with the county sheriff's department. He'd approach certain areas with the same methodical focus I'd seen him use when tracking lost hikers through dense woods, his entire body alert to signals I couldn't detect. The previous owner had been an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died 15 years earlier. According to the neighbors I'd talked to, she'd been trying to sell the property for years, but the combination of the barn's condition and the rural location had kept serious buyers away. She'd moved to Florida to be closer to her daughter, leaving the property in the hands of a real estate agent who seemed more interested in clearing it off his books than in finding the right buyer. The real estate agent had been apologetic when I'd asked about the history, explaining that Mrs. Patterson had moved to Florida and didn't want to be bothered with questions about old outbuildings. Just wants it gone, he'd said with a shrug. Been nothing but a headache for her. Husband used to spend a lot of time out there, but after he passed, she just kept it locked up. Said it made her too sad to go in there. He'd handed me a single key, a heavy brass piece that looked older than the barn itself, and wished me luck with whatever I planned to do with the place. But as Duke and I began the slow process of clearing debris from inside the barn, I started noticing details that didn't quite fit the story of simple neglect. The main doors were secured not just with the rusty padlock I'd had to cut off, but with a second locking mechanism hidden behind a sliding panel, a level of security that seemed excessive for storing farm equipment. The floor, which should have been dirt or rough planking typical of agricultural buildings from that era, was actually concrete, poured smooth and level, with drainage channels that seemed far too sophisticated for a simple storage barn. Most telling of all, the building's interior dimensions didn't match its exterior ones. I developed a good eye for spatial relationships through years of restoration work, and something was off about the northwest corner. There was a discrepancy of nearly 10 feet, suggesting a hidden space somewhere within those weathered walls. When I measured carefully, using the same techniques I'd learned for assessing vehicle frames, the math simply didn't add up. The concrete floor itself told a story that contradicted the barn's apparent age and purpose. The mix was too refined for the 1920s construction that the exterior suggested, and the finishing was too precise for agricultural use. Someone had invested considerable time and money in creating a space that looked ordinary from the outside, but was anything but ordinary inside. The drainage channels were connected to a sophisticated system that led to a dry well hidden behind the barn, infrastructure that suggested someone had planned for long-term storage of items that needed protection from moisture. Duke's behavior became increasingly focused on the northwest corner of the barn, where a wall of vertical boards seemed to dead end against the foundation stones. The boards were the same weathered gray as the rest of the building, with gaps that allowed glimpses of darkness beyond, but there was something about Duke's intense interest in that particular section that made me look more carefully. While I worked on clearing the accumulated junk of decades, old farm equipment, moldy hay bales, broken furniture that someone had stored and forgotten, he'd spend long minutes with his nose pressed against those particular boards, occasionally letting out small whines that meant he'd found something worth investigating. The debris removal itself revealed more anomalies. Much of the junk was actually carefully arranged camouflage, broken equipment positioned to look abandoned but actually serving to conceal sight lines to certain areas of the barn. Hay bales that appeared to have been left randomly were actually stacked in precise patterns that blocked access to specific sections of the walls. Even the cobwebs seemed strategically preserved, as if someone had gone to considerable trouble to make the interior look more neglected than it actually was. I found evidence of regular maintenance that contradicted the story of 15 years of abandonment. Tool marks on some of the beams were relatively fresh, rust patterns on metal components were inconsistent with the timeline I'd been given, and there were traces of oil and lubricant in places where they shouldn't have been if the building had truly been unused since Mr. Patterson's death. Someone had been caring for this barn, or at least certain parts of it, long after its supposed abandonment. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the autumn light was slanting through the gaps in the siding at just the right angle to reveal what I'd been missing. I'd been working alone, Sarah having taken the grandkids back to school shopping, when I decided to investigate Duke's obsession with that corner wall more systematically. Using a crowbar to probe between the boards, I discovered that 3 of them weren't actually nailed in place. They were held by a simple wooden latch mechanism, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The latch itself was a masterpiece of concealment, designed to look like a natural irregularity in the wood grain, but actually functioning as a sophisticated lock that could only be operated from the inside unless you understood its mechanism. When I finally figured out how to manipulate it, the entire section swung inward like a door, revealing a darkness that swallowed my flashlight beam. The hinges moved silently, recently oiled, confirming that this hidden entrance had been used within the past few years. The smell hit me first, not the musty decay I'd expected, but something sharper and more metallic. Motor oil, but old and thick, with the distinctive scent that came from long storage in closed containers. Canvas and leather, treated with preservatives that spoke of careful preparation for long-term storage. And underneath it all, something else that made the hair on my neck stand up. The faint but unmistakable smell of aviation fuel, decades old but still recognizable to someone who'd spent time around aircraft. Duke pressed against my legs, not pushing forward but not backing away either, his body tense with alertness. I could feel the vibration of a low growl in his chest, not directed at any threat but simply an expression of the intensity he felt about whatever lay beyond that hidden door. His breath was quick and shallow, the way it got when he'd located something during his search and rescue days. Not excitement exactly, but the satisfaction of a job well done. I played the flashlight beam into the hidden space and caught the reflection of metal, lots of metal, shaped in curves and angles that didn't belong to farm equipment. The reflection pattern was wrong for tractors or plows, too complex for simple tools, too refined for the agricultural implements I'd expected to find. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness and I stepped carefully into the concealed room, the full magnitude of what I was seeing began to register. What I found in that hidden section of the barn changed everything I thought I knew about Mrs. Patterson, her late husband, and the property I'd bought for $500. Covered by tarps that had been treated with preservatives and surrounded by careful barriers of hay bales and scrap lumber, was a World War II-era P-51 Mustang fighter plane, not fully intact but far more complete than anything I'd ever imagined finding outside of a museum. The fuselage was there, its aluminum skin polished to a dull sheen that spoke of careful maintenance, wings folded alongside it in a configuration that suggested someone had understood both the mechanical requirements and space limitations of long-term storage. The engine components were carefully wrapped and stored in wooden crates marked with military specifications and dates from 1944, each piece labeled and inventoried with the kind of systematic attention that spoke of professional-level maintenance. The propeller had been removed and mounted vertically against one wall, its 3 blades still bearing traces of the olive-drab paint that had been standard for military aircraft of that era. Control surfaces were individually wrapped in oiled cloth, instruments were protected by custom-fitted covers, and every removable component had been cataloged and stored according to a system that revealed both mechanical expertise and historical sensitivity. As I stood there in the darkness, flashlight beam playing over control surfaces and instrument panels, Duke beside me breathing in sharp, excited bursts, I felt the weight of discovery settle over me like a physical thing. This wasn't just a find, it was a responsibility. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve this aircraft, to hide it away for reasons I couldn't yet understand. The care evident in every aspect of the concealment suggested this wasn't stolen property but something saved, something protected, something that mattered deeply to whoever had put it here. The documentation I found over the following days told a story that left me staring at the ceiling through long, sleepless nights. Wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a metal filing cabinet that had been disguised to look like a tool chest were maintenance logs, transfer orders, and correspondence between the aircraft's original pilot and a mechanic named James Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's late husband. The papers were organized with military precision, each document in its proper place, protected from moisture and light, preserved with the same care that had been given to the aircraft itself. The pilot, Lieutenant William Morrison, had been killed in action over Germany in February 1945. His plane had made it back to England, damaged but repairable, and somehow Patterson had arranged to acquire it after the war ended. The paperwork trail was complex but legitimate, involving surplus military equipment sales and the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that became possible in the chaotic aftermath of victory. Patterson had been a crew chief with the Army Air Corps, stationed in England during the final years of the war, with both the technical knowledge and the connections necessary to pull off such an acquisition. The letters between Morrison and Patterson revealed a friendship forged in the brutal camaraderie of wartime service. Morrison had written about his plans to return to Ohio after the war, about the girl he planned to marry, about wanting to keep flying in civilian life. His letters were filled with the casual optimism of a young man who couldn't imagine a future that didn't include him, who made plans with the confidence of someone who'd survived enough missions to believe he might survive them all. Patterson had written back about his own hopes of opening a small aircraft maintenance shop, about learning everything he could about the Mustang's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, about the possibility of converting military aircraft for civilian use once the war ended. Their correspondence painted a picture of two young men planning a future that only one of them would live to see, bound by their shared understanding of the machines they worked with and the dangers they faced. Morrison's final letter, dated just 3 days before his death, contained instructions for Patterson regarding his personal effects and his plans for the aircraft they'd been maintaining together. He'd asked Patterson to keep her flying for both of us and to make sure she finds someone who understands what she means. Reading those words in the darkness of the hidden room, with Duke lying beside me and the aircraft itself gleaming in my flashlight beam, I felt the weight of a promise that had been kept for nearly 80 years. What Patterson had done after Morrison's death was remarkable in its dedication and scope. Using his connections as a military mechanic and what must have been considerable personal expense, he'd acquired not just the aircraft but also spare parts, maintenance manuals, and enough components to keep it airworthy indefinitely. The plane hadn't just been stored, it had been preserved with museum-quality attention to detail. Every metal surface had been treated against corrosion, every rubber component had been carefully wrapped and stored with desiccants to prevent deterioration, every electrical connection had been protected against moisture and the passage of time. The preservation techniques Patterson had used were sophisticated even by modern standards. He'd created a controlled environment within the hidden room, with ventilation systems that maintained proper humidity levels and temperature controls that prevented the extreme fluctuations that could damage delicate components. The concrete floor included heating elements that could be activated to prevent condensation, and the walls were insulated with materials that wouldn't off-gas or create chemical interactions with the aircraft's surfaces. But perhaps most moving of all were the personal effects I found stored alongside the aircraft. Morrison's flight jacket hung on a specially constructed hanger, treated with preservatives but still showing the wear patterns of actual use. His pilot's logbook was protected in a specially made case, its pages still crisp and readable, documenting his training flights and combat missions with the precise handwriting that had been drilled into him during flight school. There were photographs of him with his crew, letters from his fiancée, a St. Christopher medal that his mother had given him before he shipped overseas. Patterson had saved it all, creating not just a mechanical preservation but a memorial to a friendship that had ended too soon. There was even a letter, dated 1947, from Morrison's fiancée, thanking Patterson for his efforts and asking him to keep Billy's dream alive until someone who appreciates what he sacrificed can give it the attention it deserves. The letter was addressed to Patterson at his home, the same address where Mrs. Patterson had lived until recently, suggesting that this entire preservation project had been carried out literally in her backyard without her knowledge. The magnitude of what Patterson had done became clearer as I researched the current value of P-51 Mustangs. The few surviving examples commanded prices well into the millions, especially when they came with complete documentation and provenance like Morrison's aircraft. This wasn't just a significant historical artifact, it was a fortune that Mrs. Patterson apparently had no idea existed just 40 yards from her farmhouse. Either her husband had never told her about his wartime acquisition, or the knowledge had been lost in the confusion of his final illness and death. The implications of this realization kept me awake for weeks. By any legal standard, the aircraft belonged to me as part of the property purchase. I had clear title to the land and everything on it, and Patterson's acquisition of the plane appeared to have been completely legitimate according to the surplus disposal regulations of the era. But morally, the situation felt infinitely more complex. Mrs. Patterson might have lived for years in relative financial difficulty while sitting unknowingly on top of a multi-million-dollar asset. Duke's behavior during this period of discovery revealed an intelligence and sensitivity that reminded me why working dogs had been so crucial during the war. He seemed to understand the gravity of what we'd uncovered, approaching the aircraft with a respect that bordered on reverence. When I worked inside the barn, he'd position himself at the hidden entrance, alert but calm, as if standing guard over something he recognized as important. His instincts had been right from the beginning. There had been something in that barn worth investigating, something that deserved the kind of careful attention he'd been trying to draw to it. The research I conducted into Morrison's background revealed a young man whose life had been defined by service and sacrifice long before he enlisted. Born in Columbus, Ohio in 1922, he'd been the eldest of 3 children in a family that had struggled through the Depression by taking care of each other and their community. His high school yearbook showed a serious young man who'd lettered in track and served as class president, someone his peers had already identified as a natural leader. His enlistment in the Army Air Corps in 1942 had been motivated not by adventure but by duty, a family tradition that included service in World War I and even the Civil War. His training records showed exceptional aptitude for both flying and leadership, leading to his assignment as a flight leader despite his youth. The men who served under him had written letters home describing his skill and courage, his ability to bring damaged aircraft and frightened crew members safely back to base. The combat record that emerged from my research painted a picture of a pilot who'd flown more than 50 missions over occupied Europe, participating in some of the most dangerous operations of the war. His aircraft had been shot up multiple times, requiring the kind of emergency repairs that had brought him into contact with crew chiefs like Patterson. The friendship between pilot and mechanic had been forged through shared experience of life-and-death situations where trust wasn't just professional courtesy, but a matter of survival. The ethical questions that arose from this discovery consumed my thoughts for weeks. The legal ownership was clear, but the moral complexities seemed to multiply the more I learned about the people involved. There was Morrison's sacrifice, Patterson's devotion, Mrs. Patterson's unknowing poverty, and my own accidental windfall. Moreover, there was the question of Morrison's family. His fiancée might still be alive, or there might be children or grandchildren who had a moral if not legal claim to their father's or grandfather's belongings. My research into Morrison's family proved both successful and heartbreaking. I found records indicating that he'd been survived by his fiancée, Catherine Walsh, who had never married after his death. She'd lived her entire life in Columbus, working as a teacher and then a school principal, dying in 2018 at the age of 96. But she'd had a sister whose descendants still lived in Morrison's hometown, and through careful inquiry involving historical societies and genealogical databases, I located Morrison's great-nephew, David Morrison, a high school history teacher who'd grown up hearing stories about his great-uncle's service but had never known what happened to his plane. The initial contact was delicate. I called David Morrison on a Saturday morning in November, identifying myself as someone who'd found materials related to his great-uncle's military service. I didn't want to raise hopes or create expectations until I understood more about the family situation and their knowledge of Morrison's story. The conversation that followed revealed that the family had indeed preserved Morrison's memory, that Catherine Walsh had remained close to them throughout her life, and that they'd always wondered what had happened to the aircraft that had brought their relative through so many dangerous missions. The conversation with David Morrison was one of the most difficult and rewarding of my life. When I called him and explained what I'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "We always wondered. Aunt Catherine used to say that Billy's plane had made it home, that someone was taking care of it for him. We thought she was just trying to comfort herself." His voice broke slightly as he continued. She never stopped believing he was coming back for it. David agreed to drive down from Columbus the following weekend, bringing with him his own son and his grandfather, Morrison's younger brother, who was still alive at 98 and had vivid memories of his brother's war service. The meeting in the barn was emotional in ways I hadn't anticipated. The old man, confined to a wheelchair but still sharp, wept when he saw his brother's flight jacket, running his fingers over the worn leather and telling stories about Billy's letters home, about the family's pride in his service, about the devastating impact of the telegram that had announced his death. Followed were months of careful negotiation, legal consultation, and emotional consideration. David Morrison and his family had no legal claim to the aircraft, but they had something more powerful, a moral connection that resonated with everything I'd learned about Patterson's intentions. The correspondence I'd found made it clear that Patterson had always intended for Morrison's memory to be honored, for the plane to eventually find its way to people who would appreciate the sacrifice it represented. The solution we developed satisfied both practical and ethical concerns. Working with David Morrison and the Commemorative Air Force, we arranged for the Mustang to be properly restored and placed in a museum display that would honor both Morrison's service and Patterson's dedication to preserving his friend's legacy. The process generated significant media attention, and the resulting insurance settlement and tax benefits provided Mrs. Patterson with a substantial late-in-life windfall that allowed her to live comfortably in Florida while knowing her husband's secret project had finally achieved its intended purpose. The restoration process itself became a community effort. Local craftsmen donated time and expertise, veterans organizations provided funding and moral support, and the story attracted the attention of aviation enthusiasts from across the country. Duke became something of a celebrity during this period, featured in newspaper articles as the dog whose instincts had led to one of the most significant wartime aircraft discoveries in recent decades. But the most meaningful moment came when we held a small ceremony. Why at the barn before the aircraft was removed for restoration? David Morrison brought his own grandson, a boy about 10 years old who listened with wide eyes as we told the story of his great-great-uncle's service and Patterson's devotion to keeping his memory alive. The boy asked intelligent questions about the aircraft's capabilities, about life during wartime, about the courage it took to fly dangerous missions knowing that each one might be your last. Duke, now graying around the muzzle but still alert, sat beside me as we watched 3 generations of the Morrison family say goodbye to a plane that had carried their ancestor through the skies over wartime Europe. The old man had insisted on being lifted from his wheelchair so he could touch the propeller one more time, saying that he wanted to feel the connection to his brother that had been preserved for nearly 8 decades. The ceremony drew more than 200 people, including veterans, local officials, and families whose own relatives had served in the war. The local high school band played taps, and a modern P-51 from a nearby airshow performed a flyover that left most of the assembled crowd in tears. It was a moment that connected past and present, that honored both service and sacrifice, that demonstrated the power of one person's dedication to keeping faith with the past. The barn itself became part of the story's legacy. Rather than tearing it down or converting it to some other purpose, I restored it carefully, preserving the hidden section as a reminder of the secrets that ordinary places can hold. The restoration used traditional techniques and materials, maintaining the building's historical integrity while making it safe for public access. The hidden door was preserved and made functional, allowing visitors to experience the same sense of discovery that Duke and I had felt. Local school groups now visit regularly, learning about WWII aviation, the importance of preserving history for future generations, and the value of looking beyond surface appearances to find deeper truths. The barn has become a small but significant part of our community's educational resources, proof that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones that bring people together rather than setting them apart. The educational programs that developed around the barn have reached hundreds of students over the past few years. Teachers use the story as a starting point for lessons about wartime service, about the importance of friendship and loyalty, about the ways that ordinary people can preserve extraordinary legacies. The barn serves as a tangible connection to history, allowing students to stand in the same space where Patterson had worked for decades to honor his friend's memory. Chuck still teases me about my $500 investment, but his tone has changed completely. Now he asks what other junk I'm planning to buy, with the kind of respect that comes from seeing someone's crazy idea turn into something remarkable. He's even started attending the school programs at the barn, sharing his own memories of relatives who served in various wars, contributing to the educational mission that has grown around Morrison and Patterson's story. The experience taught me profound lessons about intuition, especially when reinforced by the instincts of a trusted companion like Duke. There had been signs from the very beginning that this was more than an ordinary purchase, more than a simple restoration project. Duke's initial reluctance, his subsequent focus on specific areas of the barn, his behavior during the discovery process, all of it had been communication that I'd nearly failed to recognize. The financial implications of the discovery were significant but not the most important outcome. The insurance settlements and tax advantages provided a comfortable addition to our retirement savings, but more meaningful was the knowledge that we'd played a part in preserving an important piece of history and honoring the memory of people who deserved recognition. The money allowed us to establish a small scholarship fund for local students interested in aviation or military history, ensuring that Morrison and Patterson's story would continue to inspire future generations. As I write this, Duke is lying beside me, his muzzle resting on my foot in the way that has become our evening routine. He's 13 now, moving more slowly but still alert to the possibilities that each new day might bring. Sometimes I wonder what other secrets might be hidden in the unremarkable places that surround us, waiting for someone with enough curiosity and stubbornness to look past the surface. The barn taught me that history isn't always found in museums or textbooks. Sometimes it's preserved by ordinary people who understand the value of keeping faith with the past. The experience changed my relationship with our community in ways I didn't expect. People began bringing me stories of their own family mysteries, asking for advice about researching forgotten relatives or investigating family legends that might have more truth to them than anyone had assumed. I've become an unofficial resource for historical puzzles, armed with the knowledge that patience and methodical investigation can uncover remarkable truths in the most unexpected places. Most importantly, the discovery reinforced lessons about friendship and loyalty that extend far beyond the specific story of Morrison and Patterson. The dedication that Patterson showed in preserving his friend's legacy, the trust that Morrison had placed in their relationship, the faithfulness that both men demonstrated to their shared values, these aren't just historical curiosities but living examples of how relationships should work. Duke's unwavering support throughout the entire process, from that first day when his instincts told him something was worth investigating to the present moment as he keeps me company while I reflect on what we learned, embodies the same kind of loyalty. The Barn Project also taught me about the importance of looking beyond immediate appearances, of taking time to understand the full context of any situation before making judgments. The building that everyone else had dismissed as worthless junk had been concealing one of the most remarkable preservation projects any of us had ever encountered. Patterson had spent decades creating a memorial that honored his friend's sacrifice while maintaining the kind of operational security that suggested he understood the value of what he was protecting. Looking back, I realized that the barn gave me more than just a financial windfall or a fascinating story to tell. It gave me a deeper appreciation for the hidden connections that link us across time and circumstance, for the importance of paying attention to the details that others might overlook, and for the value of trusting relationships that have been tested and proven reliable. Duke's instincts, Patterson's devotion, Morrison's sacrifice, Catherine Walsh's faith, all of these formed a chain of connection that eventually led to a 10-year-old boy learning about his family's history and a community gaining a new understanding of the extraordinary stories that can be found in ordinary places. The legacy continues to grow. The restored P-51 now flies in air shows across the Midwest, carrying Morrison's name and story to new audiences. The pilot who flies it is a retired Air Force colonel who volunteered his time because he was moved by the story of friendship and preservation that made the restoration possible. Each flight is a tribute not just to Morrison's service, but to Patterson's dedication and to the power of ordinary people to preserve extraordinary legacies. Duke's role in all of this has made him something of a local celebrity, but he bears the attention with the same quiet dignity he's shown throughout his life. Children who visit the barn always ask about the dog who found the airplane, and I'm happy to tell them about the importance of paying attention to animals who share our lives, about the ways that trust and partnership can lead to discoveries that change our understanding of the world around us. The most profound lesson of all might be that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that teach us about ourselves, about our capacity for loyalty, our responsibility to honor the sacrifices of others, and our ability to find extraordinary meaning in ordinary circumstances. The barn that everyone else dismissed as worthless contained not just a priceless aircraft, but a story about the enduring power of friendship, the importance of keeping faith with the past, and the value of trusting the instincts that tell us when something deserves our attention. Have you ever stumbled onto something that completely changed how you understand your world, something that reminded you that the most incredible discoveries often happen when you're willing to investigate what others dismiss as worthless? Have you experienced the kind of partnership with an animal companion that opens your eyes to possibilities you might have missed on your own? I'd love to hear your story, because I've learned that these moments of discovery are more common than we think. We just need the courage to pay attention when they come our way.